In February of 2017, 2 teenage girls were killed in Delphi, Indiana. On February 13th of that year, a day before Valentine's Day, 14-year-old Liberty, Libby German, and 13-year-old Abigail, Abby Williams were out hiking on a historic trailhead near downtown Delphi. They would post a couple of pictures to Snapchat before disappearing that afternoon, and an extensive search of the region would find their bodies the following day. Both had been violently killed, their throats slashed with a knife, and they were left near Deer Creek. But before their death, Libby had managed to record video and audio of the man that had likely killed them, who reportedly approached them on a high bridge and demanded they go with him down the hill at gunpoint. This individual was later dubbed Bridge Guy by authorities and the internet, and the footage obtained of him, grainy as it was used to develop a composite image that has been circulating ever since. Despite what seemed like incredibly strong evidence, the investigation into this tragic double murder quickly stagnated, beginning a multi-year process of authorities probing local deviants and offenders in a quest to identify Bridge Guy. For a time, investigators even began floating a second composite image of a much younger man they believed might have been the killer, which came out just a short time before I released my original episode on this story back in 2019. Finally, in 2022, police announced that they had identified a suspect in the crime. Then 50-year-old Richard Allen, a Delphi native that had surprisingly come forward to police very early on. In the days immediately following the murder of Abby and Libby, Allen identified himself as someone that had been on the same historic hiking trails the same day as the crime itself, and even claimed to be wearing an outfit eerily similar to that seen in the Bridge Guy footage. But for some reason, he had been cleared. This lead sheet tucked away in a folder until 2022, when it was rediscovered by a police volunteer named Kathy Shank. Shank, a retired CPS employee that organized and evaluated roughly 14,000 tips developed by law enforcement, dug up this file during her analysis and insisted that police reevaluate. Within weeks, Richard Allen had been arrested, charged with the murders of Liberty German and Abigail Williams. In the days that followed, Allen would insist that he was innocent through his attorneys, who began painting a portrait of someone that had been suffering from deteriorating mental health, but as someone who was innocent of the charges levied against him. They would claim that he was being railroaded by desperate investigators and prosecutors who had fumbled the early investigation. Allen's attorneys would insist that the real culprits had been an Odinist cult operating in the area, but more on that in a bit. In a brief update I released a couple of months ago, I told you that 52-year-old Richard Allen had been found guilty of Libby's and Abby's murders. At the time though, sentencing was still weeks away, so my update was rather brief. Well, we finally know what Richard Allen's fate is, so what better time than now to back up and analyze exactly how we got here, through a trial that was extensive and, frankly, a bit odd. At the time of his arrest in 2022, Richard Allen was a Delphi native that worked at CVS, having served in the Army National Guard and living most of his life in nearby Mexico, Indiana, an unincorporated township approximately 40 miles away from Delphi. At one point, he had worked as a store manager for a Walmart, but had been working at the Delphi CVS since 2013. Soon after the Delphi murders, Allen was interviewed as a possible witness, where he gave an officer his statement about being on the historic trails the same day as Libby and Abby. Yet, after this, he was not interviewed again for 5 years. Not until police had begun to narrow in on him again following the rediscovered lead Kathy Shank had come across, buried in the police case file. While in retrospect, Richard Allen seems like an obvious suspect, he was almost entirely forgotten about by police and seemingly cleared due to what some claim was essentially a clerical error. But thanks to Kathy Shank's hard work, police began digging back into Richard Allen's information, bringing him in for questioning in 2022. During that interview, investigators began making it clear that they were looking into him as a possible suspect, and the conversation began to grow tense. Allen was asked if he had any firearms. He did. When asked whether he would be willing to give them over to police for forensic testing, he refused. He then told investigators that they should either charge him or let him go, so he was allowed to leave, but a warrant was filed for his home and his firearms later that same day. One of the firearms that Allen owned, a .40 caliber Sig Sauer model P226, which he had purchased in 2001, was tested compared to evidence recovered at the crime scene. An unspent shell casing found underneath one of the girls' bodies was later linked to this firearm through ballistics testing. The round had not been fired, but had markings on it indicating that it had been cycled through the pistol. A short time after police learned this, Allen was arrested and charged with Abby's and Libby's murder. In the months that followed, both sides began preparing their case for the inevitable trial, as Richard Allen had pleaded not guilty and was not at all willing to negotiate a potential plea deal. Regardless, the prosecution seemed assured of their own case and were similarly unwilling to negotiate for a plea. While in custody, Richard Allen would reportedly confess to the crime multiple times during conversations with his family members, including what authorities would later hail as no less than 5 times to both his wife and mother. Allen's attorneys would insist that these confessions could not be trusted because of his declining mental state at the time. Rather, Richard Allen's defense attorneys began proposing an alternative theory of the case, that Abby and Libby had not been killed by him, Richard Allen, but rather by an Odinist cult operating in the region. They claimed that this cult, which was comprised by many of the early and tangential suspects or characters in the story, had killed the 2 girls in a sacrificial rite. As if this did not already sound like a theory pulled straight out of the satanic panic era of the 1980s, the defense would even allege that members of this Odinist cult were prison guards overseeing Allen in custody, wearing patches on their uniforms that read, "In Odin We Trust." Prosecutors would later admit that this cult angle was briefly looked into by investigators, but quickly dismissed after they consulted with experts. In 2023, Allen's attorneys were involved in a strange leaking scandal, which some of you following the case online may have already heard about. Someone linked to their office had leaked some of the evidence, namely crime scene photos of the 2 girls, to someone else unrelated to the case. From there, they had begun to leak online, and one of the figures involved with this leak had then taken their own lives. Another would face charges for the leak itself, and Allen's lawyers would attempt to withdraw from the case ahead of the trial, resulting in a number of delays that pushed it back to 2024. Because of the case's high profile, it was not going to be overseen by Carroll Circuit Court Judge Benjamin Diener, who recused himself. Instead, it would be overseen by Allen County Superior Court Judge Francis Gull, who was appointed as a special judge in this case back in November of 2022. Ahead of the trial, each side presented some pre-trial motions. The defense sought to have the murder charges against Richard Allen dismissed. Those were rejected on multiple occasions. The prosecution, meanwhile, sought to prevent the defense from presenting their Odinist cult theory during the trial. That request was granted back in September of this year, just weeks ahead of the trial itself. When the trial finally started in October, the prosecution began presenting their version of the case, which was based a lot off of information the public already knew due to the prior 2 years of legal disclosures. They highlighted Richard Allen's statement to police back in 2017, during which he admitted to being on the same trails the same day that Libby and Abby were murdered. They also went on to show the number of similarities between Allen and Bridge Guy, the man the 2 girls had interacted with right before their murders, whose likeness and voice were caught on videos recorded by Libby German. In doing so, they not only pointed out Allen's physical appearance, but his voice, with the jury hearing samples of both, Bridge Guy and him. In the trial, Carroll County prosecutor Nick McClelland told the jury, "Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. He kidnapped them and later murdered them." Prosecutors linked Allen to the crime scene itself through ballistics testing, bringing up experts and presenting evidence linking one of Allen's firearms to the unspent shell casing found underneath one of the bodies. This portion of the case was centered around the fact that even though the round itself had not been fired, it had still been cycled through Allen's pistol, leaving behind ejector, extractor, and breech markings that matched it to his Sig Sauer P226. Then, prosecutors presented what they believed to be their actual smoking gun, confessions that the defendant had made in prison to his wife and mother, during which he admitted to killing the 2 teenagers. Over the roughly 2 years he had been in custody, Allen made 61 incriminating statements to his family indicating his guilt, including an April 2023 phone call to his wife in which he told her, "I did it. I killed Abby and Libby." However, the defense would counter that many confessions like this one were couched in uncertainty, pointing out that right after he said that, his wife asked him whether his medication he had been taking was messing with his mind, to which he responded, "Because maybe I did it. I think I did it." Richard Allen's attorneys would bring in mental health experts to testify about his mental state behind bars, claiming that Allen, who already had a history of mental health issues such as depression, had begun suffering psychosis behind bars. If so, his confessions would be unreliable. They would then present the jury footage of Allen in prison, including one incident where he appeared to be eating his own feces. They claimed that this altered mental state could have made him more likely to confess to a crime that they allege he had not committed. Unable to present their alternative Odinist cult theory to the jury, Allen's attorneys would present a strategy of trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They would claim that the hairs recovered from the crime scene did not match Richard Allen. In fact, they highlighted that none of Richard Allen's DNA was found at the scene. Other than the unspent shell casing, there was no physical proof that he had been with the girls. And when it came to the shell casing itself, Allen's attorneys tried to muddy the waters around it, claiming that the ballistics testing method used by authorities was anything but concrete. They even indicated at one point that the unspent shell casing in evidence had come from a law enforcement officer's weapon, not Allen's. In perhaps the most intriguing part of the trial, in my opinion, the defense brought up a former FBI forensic examiner named Stacey Elridge to testify. She had analyzed the data from Liberty German's phone, recovered at the crime scene underneath her body, which had filmed the infamous bridge guy footage. She claimed that according to the phone's data, it appeared like someone had plugged a headphone jack into the phone at 5:45 p.m. on the day of the murder, hours after the geolocation data of the phone had stopped, presumably when they had been killed. This had reportedly happened just moments after Libby's phone received a call, with Elridge claiming the data showed the headphone jack had been plugged into within milliseconds of the call starting, which, she would point out in trial, by plugging in the cable, you would stop sound. Citing this data, Stacey Elridge would then claim that it appeared like the headphone jack had been disconnected at 10:32 p.m., roughly 5 hours later, and just about half an hour after the overnight search for the missing teens had started. This information in particular was incredibly strange, but like almost everything else, it was anything but definitive. Even on the stand, Elridge was unable to state definitively whether or not this showed that a pair of headphones had been placed into the phone's headphone port, or whether it may have been something like water or mud interacting with the phone. After presenting their dual cases over many weeks, the jury, consisting of 7 women and 5 men, began deliberating. It would take them over 19 hours to come to a consensus, with that finally coming down on November 11th. Richard Allen was found guilty on all counts, but would await sentencing until December 20th, about a week before this episode comes out. On December 20th, 2024, we found out that Richard Allen was to be sentenced to 130 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under the law. He would serve 65 years for each murder, with both sentences to be served consecutively, ensuring that, barring a successful appeal, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. During sentencing, it was reported that Judge Fran Gohl criticized Allen for his childlike behavior during the trial, telling him, "You rank up there with one of the most hideous cases I've ever presided over. These families will deal with your carnage forever, and you sit here and roll your eyes." Now, in the waning days of 2024, this is finally another mystery that we can lay to rest, assured that the killer of Liberty German and Abigail Williams has been brought to justice. But even then, per Carroll County Sheriff Tony Leggett, a form of justice was served, but it does not bring Abby or Libby back. These families will live every day without 2 of the most important people in their lives. Speaking to this, Mike Patty, Libby's grandfather, said during a press conference last week, "It's been almost 8 years coming. If I live to make it to 80, almost 10% of my life has been spent working on this." I could only hope that after 8 long, painstaking years, the families of Abby and Libby can finally begin to rest easy, knowing that the individual that took the lives of their beloved girls is now behind bars, where he can't hurt anyone but himself. Kathy Shank, the police volunteer that came upon the long-lost tip in the old case notes, has been hailed as a hero for her help in bringing this case to resolution. She was even thanked during the aforementioned press conference held last week on the date of sentencing. She was standing alongside the other law enforcement officials, and I'm glad that Sheriff Tony Leggett took a moment to thank her when he said, "The reason justice was served today was due to one person, the person that only knows how to give. She has given herself literally for free to this investigation in different ways. Since about March of 2017, Kathy Shank, while filing, scanning, organizing, found a tip that led us to be here today." If you want to listen or watch the entire press conference, I will include a link to it in the show notes. It's definitely an interesting and cathartic experience for many that have been emotionally invested in this story over the years. And in certain cases, I would even describe it as a bit frustrating, but I won't touch on that in this episode. Rather, I would encourage you to listen to it for yourself and get your own feel for it. I would like to end this episode with a positive focus on Kathy Shank, the unexpected hero of this grim saga, who has since turned down the $325,000 reward for this case, insisting that the money be used to fund the Memorial Softball Field and Scholarship Foundations established in memory of Abby and Libby after their deaths. To which I just need to say, hell yeah, Kathy, you are a fucking rock star. For now, it seems like this long saga is finally coming to an end. Richard Allen seems ready to appeal his conviction, beginning to posture himself and his legal team for that uphill battle. Should anything come from that, I'll be sure to let you know. But for now, it seems like the stories of Abby Williams and Libby German are finally resolved. I wanted to have this update episode out earlier this week, but life, sadly, had other plans for my family and I. Some of you may remember me referencing my dog Rocky over the years. Unfortunately, he is no longer with us. He got sick on and off over the last week, and we had no idea it was something major. On Christmas, whatever he had got worse, and I rushed him to the emergency vet at around 11:30 that night for him to fade away in my arms as I carried him back. This is something that I'm still coming to grips with, so I'm struggling to put into words what I feel. But his absence has already been felt in the lives of myself, my wife, our daughter, and our other furry friend, our cat Bullwinkle, who has been with Rocky for the last 7 years, her entire life and most of his. I'm not saying this to try and make you feel bad or garner some sympathy. I'm actually trying to just focus on the good qualities Rocky brought into my life, and while I miss him with all my heart and wish I would have had a chance to say goodbye, I want all of you to take this chance to show your furry friends or even those around you a little bit more love moving forward. Take your dogs on that walk you think you're too tired for. Give your dog or your cat or whoever some belly rubs or hugs, maybe even give them an extra pet or an extra treat. If not for their sake, then for mine. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye to Rocky, and if there's anything I could go back in time to change, it would be just to show him a little bit of extra love or compassion. So please, all of you, love like there's no tomorrow, because sometimes there isn't. Anyhow, much love to all of you. I hope you all had a Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah, a Happy Kwanzaa, a Merry Festivus, or whatever you may celebrate. And in the days ahead, I hope you have a happy and a safe New Year's. Until 2025, take care, y'all.